A young orphan risks his life to save a millionaire from a fire and is taken to live in his mansion. But when he discovers a dark family secret, everything takes an unexpected turn that could change his destiny forever. What truth is hidden in his past? Night was falling over the city, and the shadows of the buildings lengthened under the dim glow of the streetlights. Lucas, a young man with messy hair and eyes that reflected more stories than his few years could tell, was sitting in a corner of the park, hugging his worn backpack as if it were the only thing that kept him connected to the world. The smell of smoke arrived before the sirens. Lucas looked up, his attention drawn to a column of fire rising into the sky from a mansion a few blocks away. The flames danced wildly, lighting up the night like a beacon of chaos. Without a second thought, Lucas dropped his backpack and ran towards the fire. People had gathered in front of the mansion, shouting and pointing, but no one seemed to dare to cross the danger line. A woman was crying inconsolably while a man tried to calm her down. "There's still someone in there," she shouted. Lucas made his way through the commotion and, dodging a fireman who tried to stop him, entered the mansion. The heat was overwhelming, and the air was filled with ash that scraped his throat with every breath. The opulent decor of the entrance was charred. The furniture turned to black skeletons. "Hello! Is anyone here?" he called out, his voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. A faint moan answered from down a hallway. Following the sound, Lucas found an older man trapped under a fallen beam. The man's face was covered in soot, his eyes filled with panic. Lucas, with a strength he didn't know he had, lifted the beam high enough to free the man. "I'll get you out of here," he said, helping him up. Together, they stumbled toward the exit, each step a struggle against the flames that seemed to want to devour them. When they finally emerged into the open, the crowd erupted in cheers. Firefighters rushed to tend to the man, who would later be identified as Victor, the owner of the mansion and one of the richest men in the city. Lucas, for his part, barely had time to catch his breath before the camera flashes began to blind him. "The boy saved Mr. Victor," someone shouted. Within minutes, Lucas, the boy who, until recently, was invisible to society, had become the center of attention. Journalists were asking him questions, but he could barely understand them. His body was exhausted, and his mind was still caught up in the chaos of the burning mansion. Victor, after being treated by the paramedics, insisted on speaking to Lucas. "You saved my life," he said in a firm but grateful voice. "I want you to stay at my house while you recover. It's the least I can do." Translated from Spanish to English, www.onlinedoctranslator.com. Lucas, naturally distrustful, hesitated, but something in Victor's gaze, a mixture of gratitude and genuine concern, convinced him to accept. As the firefighters struggled to extinguish the last flames, Lucas climbed into a black car with Victor, heading to a mansion that, although intact, felt further away from his reality than ever. On that night of smoke and flashing lights, fate had begun to weave a story that would change Lucas's life forever. Dawn bathed the mansion in a golden light, making the shadows of the previous night seem like a bad dream. Lucas, although impressed by the opulence of the place, couldn't help but feel out of place. The hallways were endless, decorated with antique furniture and chandeliers that seemed to be taken from another century. The walls were covered with portraits and works of art that spoke of a family history that he neither knew nor understood. Determined to explore, he walked through the halls cautiously. There was something unsettling about the silence of the mansion, a weight that seemed laden with secrets. After turning several corners and climbing some creaking stairs, Lucas found a door ajar. Curiosity got the better of him, and he gently pushed the door open. The interior of the room was different from the rest of the house. The walls were covered with portraits from different eras, some framed in gold and others more modest, but they all shared one quality in common: they were familiar. Solemn faces stared at him from the canvas, and Lucas felt as if those staring eyes were assessing him. Walking slowly, his eyes stopped on a specific portrait. It was that of a young girl with light brown hair, a serene gaze, and a barely perceptible smile that seemed to hold a secret. His heart skipped a beat. There was something about that woman that seemed strangely familiar, as if he had seen her before, although he couldn't explain where or how. She was Gabriella, my granddaughter. A woman's soft but firm voice brought him out of his reverie. Lucas turned quickly and found an elderly woman with silver hair and an elegant bearing. It was Doña Isabella, the matriarch of the family whose presence commanded respect. "She's beautiful," Lucas said, pointing at the portrait. There was sincerity in his voice, something that didn't go unnoticed by Isabella. "He was," she replied, a hint of melancholy in her eyes. "He was the soul of this family until he left too soon." She paused as if assessing the young man in front of her. "Why are you here, Lucas? What are you looking for?" Lucas, surprised by the question, did not know what to answer. He could only lower his gaze and murmur, "I don't know." Isabella nodded slowly, as if she understood something he didn't. "There's something about you, something familiar," she said before turning and walking out of the room, leaving Lucas alone with his thoughts and the portraits that seemed to tell stories he couldn't decipher. As he walked back to his room, Lucas couldn't stop thinking about Gabriella and that strange connection he had felt when looking at her portrait. A feeling of restlessness and curiosity began to grow inside him, as if that encounter had awakened something dormant in his soul. The sun was shining brightly that morning, but Lucas barely noticed it as he walked through the mansion's gardens. His mind was caught up in the events of the previous night. Gabriella's gaze in the portrait and Doña Isabella's words, which seemed loaded with a meaning he couldn't quite grasp. Adjusting the jacket he'd been given to make himself more comfortable, he noticed the familiar weight of the medallion hanging around his neck. It was a simple but precious object to him, a silver pendant with a worn inscription on the back. His mother had given it to him when he was little, saying it was a memento of someone important, though she never explained who. As he examined the medallion, lost in thought, he didn't notice that Donna Isabella had silently approached. "What do you have there, Lucas?" she asked, pointing at the pendant with a mixture of curiosity and surprise. Lucas, somewhat nervous, held the medallion in his hand. "It's something my mother gave me," he replied, his voice barely audible. "She said it was important." Doña Isabella extended her hand, and Lucas, after a moment's hesitation, handed her the medallion. As she turned it over, the old woman held her breath. Her eyes filled with wonder and a hint of emotion. "This medallion was Gabriella's," she said finally, with a tremor in her voice. Lucas was stunned. "How can that be possible?" he asked, feeling the ground beneath his feet shake. Isabella carefully handed the locket back to Lucas. "I recognize it by the inscription," she explained, pointing to the nearly faded letters. "She always carried it with her. It was a gift from someone special." She paused as if trying to gather her thoughts. "How did this locket come into your hands?" Lucas swallowed. "My mother gave it to me, but she never talked much about her past. She just said it was something I should always keep with me." Isabella's eyes narrowed, assessing the young man's words. "Your mother? What else do you know about her?" she asked, her tone more urgent now. Lucas shook his head. "Not much. She died when I was little. All I have of her is this locket and some hazy memories." Isabella's expression changed. There was more than just curiosity in her gaze. She seemed to be fighting an internal storm of emotions and unanswered questions. "This can't be a coincidence," she muttered to herself. "Lucas, I think there's something more behind all of this. Something we need to find out." Lucas's heart was pounding. For the first time, he felt that his past, so shrouded in shadows, could be connected to something bigger, something he had never imagined. Isabella, with determination in her voice, said, "I'm going to look for some things that might give us answers. You stay close and don't say anything to anyone, especially Victor." Lucas nodded, though he couldn't help but feel trapped in a web of secrets that were just beginning to unfold. As he walked back to his room, caressing the locket with his fingers, he knew his life was about to change forever. The atmosphere in the mansion had changed since the conversation with Doña Isabella. Lucas could feel it in every glance and whisper that followed him through the halls. Although Doña Isabella had shown interest and empathy, Victor, the owner of the mansion, did not share the same feeling. From the moment Lucas entered his life, he had been watching him with distrust. That afternoon, Lucas decided to stay away from the rest of the family and explore the back gardens, looking for a moment of calm. But even there, he felt someone's eyes on him. Turning sharply, he saw one of the mansion's employees staring at him from a distance. before looking away and walking away. A feeling of unease grew in his chest. As Lucas walked back into the house, Victor intercepted him in the hallway. "What are you planning, boy?" he asked bluntly, his tone cold as a knife. Lucas looked at him, surprised by the aggression in his voice. "I'm not planning anything. I'm just here because you invited me," he replied sincerely, although his tone betrayed some annoyance. Victor assessed him for a moment, arms crossed. "I don't trust you. Ever since you came along, this all seems too convenient. You saved my life, and now all of a sudden, you're gaining my mother's sympathy." His gaze hardened. "I'm going to make sure you don't have any ulterior motives." Lucas felt a lump of frustration form in his throat. He had done nothing to deserve such treatment, but he knew there was no point in arguing with such a powerful man. "I don't need anything from you or your family," he finally said before turning and walking off to his room. Meanwhile, in another part of the mansion, Victor was making a private call. "I want you to investigate the boy," he said in a firm voice. "I want to know everything about him, where he came from, who his family is, and how he got here." When he hung up, his expression was still a mix of distrust and determination. That night at dinner, Lucas sensed the tensions at the table. Although Isabella tried to keep the conversation friendly, other members of the family looked at him with disdain. They whispered among themselves, as if they didn't bother to hide their contempt. Lucas gritted his teeth and tried to ignore them, but each veiled comment made him feel more out of place. When he finally retreated to his room, he let out a sigh of relief. He knew it wouldn't be easy to stay in the mansion, but he also understood now that not everyone saw him as a hero. Some, like Victor, considered him a threat. That night, as the wind rattled the windows, Lucas promised himself not to be intimidated. There was something deeper at play, and he was determined to find out, no matter how many obstacles stood in his way. Dawn came silently, covering the mansion with a soft light that barely managed to soften the tensions of the previous night. In her room, Doña Isabella was restless, unable to forget the medallion that Lucas wore. Something inside her told her that there was a buried truth that needed to come to light, but she didn't know where to start. She decided to go through Gabriella's old belongings, hoping to find some clue. With trembling hands, she opened an old trunk that had been closed for years. Inside were objects that brought back painful memories: photos, small ornaments, and a wooden box that Gabriella used to guard jealously. Isabella slowly opened it and, inside, found a letter. It was aged with yellowed edges, but she recognized it immediately. It was her granddaughter's handwriting. He sat down in a chair by the window, his heart racing, and began to read. "Dear Grandma, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have the courage to tell you in person. I'm pregnant. The baby's father is a humble man, someone I love deeply, but I know my family will never accept him. I'm scared. I'm afraid of my father's reaction, of his fury, and of what he might do. Please, Grandma, if anything happens to me, take care of my son. He's not to blame for my decisions or the decisions of this family. I love him, and I hope that one day you'll find a way to protect him." Isabella dropped the letter onto her lap, unable to hold back her tears. Gabriella's words echoed in her mind like a painful echo. She brought her hands to her face, trying to process what she had just read. The letter had never been sent. It had never been read, and now it was all starting to make sense. "Lucas," she muttered to herself. The possibility that he was Gabriella's son kept growing in her mind. Everything fit: his age, the locket, and that strange connection she had felt when looking at him. But she needed proof, something more than a hunch. She put the letter away carefully and left her room. She walked down the stairs with a determined stride and found Victor in his office going through paperwork. He looked up when his mother entered, immediately noticing her serious expression. "We need to talk," Isabella said, making it clear that she would accept no excuses. Victor frowned. "What is it about?" She placed the letter on the desk in front of him. "It's time for you to face the past, Victor. This letter from Gabriella changes everything." Victor read it silently, his face changing from shock to remorse. "Why didn't I know about this before?" he muttered, his voice cracking. But before he could say anything else, Isabella interrupted him. "The important thing now is Lucas. I think he could be Gabriella's son. We can't ignore this." Victor clenched the letter in his hands. Although he still doubted Lucas, the weight of the revelation was beginning to break down the barriers he had built in his mind. Isabella stared at him, determined to protect the young man at all costs. The atmosphere in the mansion had become dense, charged with secrets that seemed about to come to light. Lucas, oblivious to the revelations of Doña Isabella and Victor, was beginning to feel that something strange was happening around him. The furtive glances and whispered comments had become more frequent, and a feeling of latent danger was beginning to haunt him. One afternoon, as he was strolling through the gardens in search of some peace and quiet, he noticed he was being followed. A figure dressed in dark clothing was watching him from a distance, trying to stay hidden among the bushes. Lucas stopped dead in his tracks and turned on his heels, facing the man. "Who are you? Why are you following me?" he asked firmly, trying to remain calm. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a few steps back and quickly disappeared into the trees. Although Lucas tried to follow him, he lost track. As he returned to the mansion, his mind was filled with questions. Who was watching him, and why? That same evening, while he was dining alone in the kitchen, one of the house staff discreetly handed him an envelope. "This is for you," she said quietly before disappearing. Lucas cautiously opened the envelope. Inside, he found a check for a considerable sum of money and a note that read, "Get out before it's too late. This doesn't concern you." Anger filled him. It was clear that someone in the family wanted to get rid of him, but he couldn't understand why. What was so threatening about him? Lucas clenched the check in his hand, his resolve strengthening. He wasn't going to give in. There was something about this house that connected to his past, and he wouldn't leave until he found out the truth. The next morning, Lucas decided to confront the situation. He took the check directly to Mrs. Isabella, who received it in her office. "Someone gave me this last night," he said, placing the envelope on the table. "They want me to leave." Isabella took the check and examined it with a look of disgust. "This is the work of someone who is afraid of what you might discover," she said, looking up to look directly at Lucas. "But don't worry, son. As long as I'm here, no one will touch you." Isabella's words gave him brief relief, but Lucas knew he had to stay alert. That same afternoon, as he walked through the main hall, he overheard snippets of a conversation between Victor and a man on the phone. "Keep digging. I want to know everything about his mother and where she came from." Lucas felt a stab of anger. He knew Victor was suspicious of him, but he now understood that it wasn't just a matter of attitude. He was being actively investigated. That night, as he looked out of his bedroom window at the sky, Lucas decided he wasn't going to be intimidated. If his family tried to push him away, it only meant he was closer to finding out the truth, and he wasn't going to give up. The mansion was quiet that afternoon, but inside a storm was brewing. Doña Isabella, after reading Gabriella's letter and connecting the dots, had decided to confront Victor once and for all. She knew it was time to bring the truth to light, no matter the consequences. In the large main hall, Victor was sitting on one of the sofas, absorbed in papers related to his business. Isabella entered with the letter in her hand, her expression determined. "Victor, we need to talk right now," he said, his tone firm. He looked up, noticing the paper his mother was holding. "This again? We already discussed what that letter says." "No, we haven't discussed it enough," Isabella replied. "Lucas deserves to know who he is, and you need to accept the truth. Gabriella was pregnant, and Lucas could be her child. You can't continue to ignore what's in front of you." Victor sighed, massaging his temples. "Do you realize what you're saying? If that's true, how would I deal with the fact that my daughter felt so rejected by me that she never told me? How would I live with that weight?" "That's exactly why you have to face him," Isabella insisted. "It's not just for you, it's for Lucas. That boy has lived a life full of shortcomings and unanswered questions, and now that he's here, he deserves to know the truth." Before Victor could respond, Lucas appeared in the doorway of the living room. He had heard most of the conversation, and his face showed a mixture of confusion and anger. "What are you talking about?" he asked, crossing his arms. Isabella exchanged a glance with Victor before approaching Lucas. "There is something you need to know, son," she said calmly. "Gabriella, my granddaughter, was your mother." The words rang through the air like thunder. Lucas froze, trying to process what he had just heard. "That can't be," he finally said, his voice shaking. "My mother never talked about her family. Why would she keep something like that from me?" Isabella looked at him sadly. "I think she was afraid of what her father might do." Victor was very hard on her, and that made her push away. But now everything fits together. The locket, your age, and this letter. She held out the letter to Lucas, who took it with trembling hands. As he read, Gabriella's words hit him like a wave. Tears began to pool in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "So, does that mean you're my grandfather?" he asked, looking directly at Victor. Victor stood up, feeling the weight of the boy's gaze. "It seems so," he replied, his voice heavy with regret. "And I don't know how to begin to repair all the damage I've caused. I can only tell you that I am deeply sorry about what happened with Gabriella." Lucas stared at him silently for a moment before taking a step back. "I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did to her. I don't even know if I want to be a part of this family." Isabella took a step towards him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I understand that this is a lot for you, Lucas, but I want you to know that you will always have a place here, and you are not obligated to accept anything you don't want." Lucas nodded slowly. "I need time to think," he said before turning and walking out of the room. His heart was filled with mixed emotions. Sadness, anger, but also a small spark of hope that maybe he was finally finding the missing pieces of his life. The night enveloped the mansion in a heavy silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the trees. Lucas couldn't sleep. The day's revelations had left him at an emotional crossroads. As he stared at the ceiling of his room, he felt the weight of his past, and his newfound connection to family was too much to bear. He got out of bed, grabbed his worn backpack, and began packing what little he had. Each movement was slow and deliberate, as if with each item of clothing he put away, he was distancing himself from everything he had just discovered. When the first ray of sunlight appeared on the horizon, Lucas had already made up his mind. He couldn't stay there. He needed space, time to process everything, and above all, to escape the pressure of Victor and Isabella's expectant gazes. As he walked down the stairs, his steps were light, almost inaudible. However, when he reached the hall, he found Dona Isabella waiting for him. She was sitting in one of the chairs, her gaze calm but full of concern. "Where are you going, son?" he asked, although his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Lucas tightened the strap of his backpack and sighed. "I can't stay here, Dona Isabella. This is all too much. I don't know who I really am, and being here only confuses me more." Isabella stood up gracefully, approaching him. "I understand, Lucas, but I want you to know something. This will always be your home, and I will always be here for you, no matter how much time you need." Her words touched something deep in Lucas's heart, but they didn't change his mind. "Thank you," he said simply, looking down, "for everything." Isabella watched him as he walked through the front door, the morning sun illuminating his figure as he walked away. Her heart sank as she watched him go, but she knew it was the right thing to do. Lucas needed time to find his own answers. Back on the streets, Lucas felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. He had returned to the place he had always known, but it no longer felt like home. Something inside him had changed, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what his place in the world was. Meanwhile, at the mansion, Isabella faced Victor, who looked more worried than ever. "What are you going to do now?" he asked, frustrated. "I will bring him back," Isabella replied firmly, "but I won't do it by force. Lucas needs to know that we accept him, that we want him here, and for that, you will have to show him that you are willing to change." Victor nodded slowly, knowing his mother was right. If he wanted to rebuild what was left of his family, he would have to start by earning Lucas's trust. The main hall of the mansion was filled with Victor's family and close associates. There was a palpable tension in the air, as everyone knew that the patriarch had called an important meeting. As the lights from the chandelier illuminated the room, Victor rose from his seat in the center of the room. His expression was serious, but in his eyes there was a determination that had not been seen in him before. "I have something important to say today," he began, his voice ringing with authority. The conversations immediately ceased, and all eyes focused on him. "For years I have led this family and our company with a firm hand, but also with too much harshness. I have made mistakes that have cost us more than I imagined." Victor's words left many of those present surprised, especially the more critical members of the family, who had never seen him admit to mistakes. "One of those mistakes," he continued, was not listening to my daughter Gabriela when she needed it the most. My pride and my rigidity drove her away, and that is something I will carry with me forever. Doña Isabella, sitting in front, nodded approvingly. She knew how much it was costing Victor to take this step, but she also understood that it was necessary. Victor paused and took a deep breath before continuing. Today I discovered that I have a grandson, Lucas, Gabriela's son. Although I doubted him at first, I now know that he deserves better from me, from all of us. That's why I've made a decision. Murmurs began to fill the room, but Victor held up a hand, calling for silence. I'm stepping down as president of the company, he announced, leaving everyone speechless. It's time for someone else to take the reins, someone with a fresh vision. My priority now will be to rebuild this family and make sure Lucas feels part of it. The reaction was mixed. Some applauded, acknowledging the gesture as an act of bravery, while others remained in disbelief and silent. But before anyone could intervene, the front door was flung open. Lucas was there, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had heard part of the speech from the hallway, drawn by the voices and the mention of his name. His gaze was wary, but there was something else. Curiosity and a hint of hope. Do you really think that with one speech you can fix everything you've done? Lucas asked, his tone defiant. The room fell into absolute silence. Victor turned to him, surprised but prepared. No, Lucas. I don't think a speech can change the past, but it's a start. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I want to try. I want to show you that we can build something different. Lucas stared at him, searching for signs of sincerity in his words. I don't know if I can trust you, he finally admitted, but I'm willing to give you a chance. Not for you, but for me. I need to know if I can find something here that I didn't have anywhere else. Lucas's words were a relief to Victor, who nodded solemnly. That's all I can ask for, he replied. Doña Isabella smiled from her seat, watching how, little by little, the family began to heal. She knew there was a long road ahead, but this moment was an important step towards a more hopeful future. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the mansion, but this time, the atmosphere was different. There was a feeling of renewal, of something that had begun to heal. Lucas, standing in front of a window in his new room, looked out over the vast garden with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. The place, which had previously seemed intimidating, was now beginning to feel a little more welcoming. Since the day he decided to return, things had changed. Victor was making a genuine effort to connect with him. While it wasn't easy to erase years of mistrust, small actions, like conversations over breakfast or invitations to accompany him on tours of the property, were beginning to build a bridge between them. That morning, Victor found him in the dining room. Lucas, there's something I want to show you, he said with a shy smile. Something unusual for him. Lucas followed him into a room that had been recently emptied and redecorated. On the walls were drawings and photographs of smiling children, and in the center of the room, a large board with plans and proposals. I am going to start a project to help homeless children and young people, Victor explained. It is my way of making amends for what I have done wrong, and I want you to be part of this, if you agree. Lucas watched the plans with interest, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt before. I want to help, he replied, his voice firm. I know what it's like to be on the streets, to feel like you have nowhere to go. If I can do something to change that for others, I want to try. Victor nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then we'll work together. This isn't just a project, Lucas. It's a way to build something that matters. I have something important to say today, he began, his voice ringing with authority. The conversations immediately ceased, and all eyes focused on him. For years, I have led this family and our company with a firm hand, but also with too much harshness. I have made mistakes that have cost us more than I imagined. Victor's words left many of those present surprised, especially the more critical members of the family, who had never seen him admit to mistakes. One of those mistakes, he continued, was not listening to my daughter Gabriela when she needed it the most. My pride and my rigidity drove her away, and that is something I will carry with me forever. Doña Isabella, sitting in front, nodded approvingly. She knew how much it was costing Victor to take this step, but she also understood that it was necessary. Victor paused and took a deep breath before continuing. Today I discovered that I have a grandson, Lucas, Gabriella's son. Although I doubted him at first, I now know that he deserves better from me, from all of us. That's why I've made a decision. Murmurs began to fill the room, but Victor held up a hand, calling for silence. I'm stepping down as president of the company, he announced, leaving everyone speechless. It's time for someone else to take the reins, someone with a fresh vision. My priority now will be to rebuild this family and make sure Lucas feels part of it. The reaction was mixed. Some applauded, acknowledging the gesture as an act of bravery, while others remained in disbelief and silent. But before anyone could intervene, the front door was flung open. Lucas was there, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had heard part of the speech from the hallway, drawn by the voices and the mention of his name. His gaze was wary, but there was something else. Curiosity and a hint of hope. Do you really think that with one speech you can fix everything you've done? Lucas asked, his tone defiant. The room fell into absolute silence. Victor turned to him, surprised but prepared. No, Lucas. I don't think a speech can change the past, but it's a start. I know I have no right to ask you for anything, but I want to try. I want to show you that we can build something different. Lucas stared at him, searching for signs of sincerity in his words. I don't know if I can trust you, he finally admitted, but I'm willing to give you a chance. Not for you, but for me. I need to know if I can find something here that I didn't have anywhere else. Lucas's words were a relief to Victor, who nodded solemnly. That's all I can ask for, he replied. Doña Isabella smiled from her seat, watching how, little by little, the family began to heal. She knew there was a long road ahead, but this moment was an important step towards a more hopeful future. The first rays of sunlight illuminated the mansion, but this time, the atmosphere was different. There was a feeling of renewal, of something that had begun to heal. Lucas, standing in front of a window in his new room, looked out over the vast garden with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. The place, which had previously seemed intimidating, was now beginning to feel a little more welcoming. Since the day he decided to return, things had changed. Victor was making a genuine effort to connect with him. While it wasn't easy to erase years of mistrust, small actions, like conversations over breakfast or invitations to accompany him on tours of the property, were beginning to build a bridge between them. That morning, Victor found him in the dining room. Lucas, there's something I want to show you, he said with a shy smile. Something unusual for him. Lucas followed him into a room that had been recently emptied and redecorated. On the walls were drawings and photographs of smiling children, and in the center of the room, a large board with plans and proposals. I am going to start a project to help homeless children and young people, Victor explained. It is my way of making amends for what I have done wrong, and I want you to be part of this, if you agree. Lucas watched the plans with interest, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt before. I want to help, he replied, his voice firm. I know what it's like to be on the streets, to feel like you have nowhere to go. If I can do something to change that for others, I want to try. Victor nodded, satisfied with the answer. Then we'll work together. This isn't just a project, Lucas. It's a way to build something that matters. Over time, Lucas began to feel more comfortable in the mansion. He connected with the house staff, who gradually stopped seeing him as an outsider. Doña Isabella, for her part, was his greatest ally. They would spend afternoons talking in the garden, where she would tell him stories about Gabriella and her youth. For Lucas, those conversations were like discovering missing pieces of a puzzle that had been incomplete all his life. One day, while walking through the same neighborhood where he had spent years surviving, Lucas noticed something different about himself. He no longer felt like an outsider in his own life. He now had a purpose, a place to return to, and people who cared about him. Back at the mansion, he met with Victor and Isabella to discuss the progress of the project. We could start with a small shelter, Lucas suggested, something that is more personal, so the children feel that we really care. Victor looked at him proudly. That's a great idea. This project is already getting better thanks to you. That night, as the stars twinkled over the mansion, Lucas sat by his bedroom window and smiled to himself. His life wasn't perfect, but for the first time, he had hope. He had found a new beginning, and with it, the chance to build something better, not just for himself, but for everyone who crossed his path. Luke's story teaches us that despite the adversities and secrets of the past, we can always find a new beginning if we are willing to face the truth and build genuine connections. Sometimes life puts us in front of difficult decisions that lead us to question who we are and what we want. What would you have done in Luke's place? Would you have had the courage to stay and search for answers, or would you have gone your own way? Click on the video on screen to continue this fascinating journey of self-discovery and discover more stories that inspire you to grow. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content that can change your perspective.